how hate crimes legislation is now being refashioned through anti-bullying laws in schools. So we can talk about that during the Q&A, especially in the wake of the Tyler Clementi sentencing that's coming up. So we can think about how we can strategize and kind of sharpen these tools that Dean was talking about collectively. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit more about hate crimes legislation. On October 22nd, 2009, Obama signed the James Byrd Jr. Matthew Shepard hate crimes enhancement legislation, which what it essentially did was extend the already existing federal hate crimes laws to include the special categories of gender and sexuality, right? And so this was kind of championed by these large LGBT rights groups as an incredible victory, right? And what I want us to think about is the ways in which this victory is actually another iteration of the crushing violence that is the prison industrial complex, right? So as trans and queer prison abolitionists, we need to be resisting that as well, right? We need to be resisting the violence that happens to people as well as the ways in which the state uses that violence to reproduce violence under its own name. And so very briefly, because I want to leave us some time for the Q&A, I want to think a little bit historically about where these laws come from, right? And Vicki offered us a great kind of history of the ways in which the first boom, the first mass moment of incarceration follows the alleged ending of slavery with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which were the Civil War amendments. And essentially what happened in terms of federal laws around hate crimes, they find their kind of origins in the moment right after Reconstruction in the United States. And what was happening then and what continues to happen now is hundreds of thousands of black people were being lynched, right? We know that lynchings were a common practice, that white families would go watch these lynchings, that Kodak infamously produced and sold postcards of these lynchings. And the first kind of, or the kernel of what we see now as hate crimes legislation was introduced by the federal government there under these things called the force codes. And essentially what it was doing was alleging to curtail lynching through criminalizing the gathering of people in public. It's also part of the black codes, right? And so one of the infamous ones was the criminalization of 3 or more adults gathering together in public. And of course what this did, because we live in a fundamentally white supremacist and settler colonialist state, is that it ended up being used to imprison black people, right? And so this law that is being sold and purports to curtail the drastic, brutal practices of lynching ends up imprisoning black people. And I think that that's important to think about where these things come from, because what's going to, something that we ask ourselves a lot when we're doing abolitionist organizing is something that we're fighting for now, something that we're going to have to be fighting against in 5 years or in 10 years, right? And so I think looking historically at that moment might help us sharpen our tools to think about how we can create some critical dialogue around hate crimes legislation in the contemporary moment. And also the anti-bullying legislation, because there's a lot of proposed legislation. Most of it is state-based, but I think there'll be more and more federal-based legislation that's going to allege to curtail the massive the massive practice of bullying of young people. So that's also something we can talk about in the question and answer. And so while we have all these incredibly gnarly things, and we can talk about them more, and Rollo's going to talk a little bit more about her piece and captive genders, I also wanted to kind of give some space to think about the ways that we have historically resisted and the ways that we have continued that arc, right? So for me, thinking about, we have the normalization of mainstream LGBT politics, but we also have this kind of arc that runs through it and interferes with it continually, right? And there's a story that Raina Gossett, who works at Sylvia Rivera Law Project, tells really beautifully, and I'm not going to tell it as beautifully as her, unfortunately. She's really good at it.